Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a medieval world where history quietly buried some of its greatest disasters beneath the shadows of kings, castles, and famous battles. When people think about the Middle Ages, they usually imagine armored knights riding across green fields, towering stone fortresses standing against distant hills, bustling marketplaces filled with merchants, or perhaps devastating events like the Black Death that still echo through history books today. Yet countless other catastrophes unfolded across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East that shaped entire generations before gradually fading from popular memory. These forgotten tragedies rarely became legends. Few monuments were raised to remember them. Many survivors left behind only scattered chronicles written by exhausted monks, frightened travelers, or local officials who never imagined that centuries later their words would become the last surviving witnesses. Tonight, we leave behind the famous stories and instead follow those almost invisible footsteps through villages washed away by impossible floods, prosperous towns reduced to silent ruins by unexpected earthquakes, harvests destroyed by weather that no one could explain, and mysterious winters that changed the lives of ordinary families forever. Rather than following kings and generals, we will spend our time alongside farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, monks, traders, mothers, and children, whose names history rarely preserved. Their lives remind us that for most people living in the medieval world, survival itself was often the greatest achievement. Before we settle into tonight's journey, you might like to pause for just a second and subscribe if you enjoy slow historical storytelling. And if you're already feeling comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, settle beneath your favorite blanket, and allow the quiet rhythm of forgotten history to carry you gently into the night. The medieval world often appeared remarkably stable from a distance. Massive cathedrals slowly rose toward the sky over generations. Stone castles seemed permanent enough to outlast entire dynasties. Monasteries carefully copied manuscripts that had already survived for centuries. Roads linked familiar towns together, and each season generally followed a pattern that communities expected. Spring brought planting, summer encouraged growth, autumn rewarded labor with harvests, and winter demanded patience. Most people believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough that they could prepare for it. But beneath that appearance of stability rested extraordinary fragility. Entire communities depended upon harvests that could fail because of only a few weeks of unusual weather. Rivers that normally nourished fertile farmland could suddenly overflow with astonishing force. Mountain slopes that had remained motionless for generations occasionally collapsed without warning. Coastal settlements relied upon seas that sometimes became terrifying enemies instead of generous providers. The medieval world lacked modern forecasting, scientific understanding, emergency planning, or rapid communication. When disaster arrived, it often did so without explanation. One forgotten catastrophe began not with dramatic explosions or terrifying armies, but with rain. At first, few people considered the weather remarkable. Rain was expected during certain seasons. Farmers welcomed moisture after dry weeks. Wells filled more easily. Streams flowed with renewed energy. Water wheels turned steadily beside village mills, grinding grain into flour that would become bread for nearby families. Children played beside muddy paths, while livestock grazed across damp meadows. Everything appeared entirely ordinary. Then the rain continued. Day after day, clouds refused to disappear. Fields remained saturated long after they should have begun drying. Roads transformed into thick stretches of mud where carts struggled to move. Horses exhausted themselves pulling loads that normally required little effort. Merchants arrived later than expected, sometimes deciding not to travel at all because bridges had become unsafe. The rivers responded slowly. Unlike sudden flash floods, these waterways expanded almost patiently. Their banks gradually disappeared beneath rising currents. Fishermen noticed familiar landmarks slipping beneath the surface. Trees growing beside the water found their roots submerged. Ferry operators shortened their crossings because the current became increasingly difficult to control. People watched carefully. Generations of experience had taught them to respect rivers. Every community possessed stories about previous floods. Grandparents remembered particularly wet years. Local priests recalled damaged bridges. Millers paid close attention because their livelihoods depended upon water levels remaining manageable. Still, few imagined what would happen next. The medieval climate occasionally produced extraordinary sequences of storms stretching across enormous regions. Modern historians studying tree rings, lake sediments, and surviving written records have discovered that certain years brought rainfall far beyond ordinary expectations. To people living at the time, however, no scientific explanation existed. Some believed divine anger had descended upon the land. Others interpreted unusual weather as a warning before greater suffering yet to come. Whatever its cause, the rain intensified. Roofs leaked continuously. Grain stored inside barns absorbed unwanted moisture. Firewood became increasingly difficult to dry. Families struggled to keep indoor fires burning, filling cramped homes with smoke that lingered because damp air refused to carry it away efficiently. Livestock suffered quietly. Sheep developed illnesses after standing for long periods upon soaked ground. Horses found less nutritious grass because fields remained underwater. Chickens laid fewer eggs. Cattle lost weight despite their owners' careful attention. Medieval households depended upon these animals not only for food, but also for transportation, clothing, farming, and trade. Every weakened animal represented growing uncertainty. Eventually, the rivers escaped completely. Water spread across floodplains where villages had stood safely for generations. Wooden fences disappeared beneath swirling currents. Gardens vanished first, then orchards. Finally, entire homes stood surrounded by muddy water that continued climbing higher with alarming persistence. Families hurried to rescue what little they could. Furniture was carried toward higher ground whenever possible. Valuable tools received greater attention than decorative possessions because tools meant survival after the flood ended. Sacks of grain became precious cargo. Religious manuscripts were carefully protected inside monasteries. Livestock were driven uphill if suitable land remained available. Not everyone succeeded. Some elderly residents moved too slowly. Others refused to abandon homes built by parents and grandparents decades earlier. A lifetime spent in one place made departure emotionally unbearable, even when remaining became dangerous. Throughout Europe, medieval chronicles occasionally describe floods swallowing entire settlements with surprisingly restrained language. Monastic writers often recorded events briefly, noting damaged churches, drowned livestock, ruined harvests, and displaced populations before continuing their yearly accounts. Yet behind those short entries lay thousands of interrupted lives. Imagine standing inside a wooden house while listening to water striking the outer walls throughout the night. The floor grows damp. The fire becomes weaker. Outside, neighbors shout through darkness as they attempt to move frightened animals. Children remain awake despite exhaustion because unfamiliar sounds prevent sleep. No one knows whether morning will bring safety or greater danger. For many medieval families, that uncertainty became the true disaster. Floodwater rarely vanished quickly. Instead, it lingered across fields for weeks. Even after rivers retreated, thick layers of mud covered farmland that should have supported crops. Seeds already planted simply disappeared. Surviving plants often rotted before reaching maturity. Wells became contaminated. Dead animals polluted nearby water sources. The immediate destruction proved devastating. The consequences afterward became even worse. Without successful harvests, food supplies steadily declined. Grain prices increased beyond what many laborers could afford. Bakers produced smaller loaves using poorer quality flour. Families stretched meals by adding whatever wild plants they could safely gather from surrounding forests. Fish became increasingly important where rivers remained productive. Although damaged boats often limited fishing itself, monasteries attempted to provide relief whenever possible. Their granaries sometimes contained reserves gathered over previous years. Wealthier religious communities distributed bread to hungry travelers and nearby villagers. Chroniclers occasionally praised abbots who opened stored supplies despite uncertain futures. Such generosity undoubtedly saved lives, although available resources rarely matched overwhelming need. Travel also became dangerous. Roads washed away beneath persistent flooding, isolated entire regions. Merchants avoided uncertain crossings. News traveled slowly because messengers struggled to navigate damaged routes. Communities that normally depended upon trade suddenly found themselves almost entirely alone. Isolation changed everything. A village unable to import grain could not simply purchase food elsewhere. A town lacking timber could not easily rebuild damaged bridges. Medical knowledge remained limited, and physicians themselves often could not reach affected areas. Medieval society relied upon connections that disasters quietly severed. As autumn approached, anxiety replaced hope. Farmers measured remaining crops with increasingly worried expressions. Barns stood far emptier than usual. Families counted preserved vegetables, dried beans, smoked meat, and precious sacks of grain, calculating whether supplies might survive the approaching winter. Many already suspected the answer. It would not be enough, and as darkness settled earlier each evening across the flooded countryside, another forgotten chapter of medieval disaster was only beginning to unfold. Sound of the rain had finally begun to fade, yet the damage it left behind became more visible with each passing day. The rivers slowly returned to their familiar channels, but the land they had crossed was no longer the same. Thick layers of mud hardened across once fertile fields. In some places, the rich topsoil had been washed away entirely, exposing rocky ground beneath. Elsewhere, the rivers had carved new channels through the countryside, erasing property boundaries that had existed for generations. Families who had farmed the same plots for centuries suddenly found themselves unable to identify where one field ended and another began. These changes affected far more than agriculture. They quietly reshaped relationships within entire communities. Neighbors who had always known exactly where their land began and ended now faced uncomfortable uncertainty. Small disagreements emerged over damaged fences, altered stream beds, and vanished landmarks. Most villages relied on respected elders to settle these disputes through discussion rather than conflict. Yet in the hardest hit regions, even the oldest memories could no longer match the transformed landscape. Winter had not fully arrived, but its presence could already be felt in the air. Dense morning fog lingered over the fields long after sunrise. Walking across damp grass quickly soaked boots and clothing. Keeping a fire burning inside the home became increasingly difficult because dry firewood was becoming scarce. Forests that normally supplied fuel had remained flooded for weeks, leaving countless fallen branches too wet to burn properly. Even when a fire finally caught, it often produced more smoke than warmth. The thick smoke filled cramped homes, stinging tired eyes and making it difficult for children and elderly people to breathe comfortably. Most medieval houses were far from warm by modern standards. Stone and timber walls blocked some of the wind, but countless gaps allowed cold air to creep inside. Glass windows were rare outside wealthy households. Many homes relied on simple wooden shutters or stretched animal hides to keep out the weather. During long periods of damp, freezing conditions, there was little anyone could do to make the interior truly comfortable. At precisely this moment, another hardship became impossible to ignore. Food was growing scarce. The wheat that had promised a healthy harvest only months earlier had largely been ruined. Barley, oats, and rye crops, usually known for surviving difficult conditions, had also produced disappointing yields. Village mills no longer received the steady stream of grain they once depended upon. Millers waited beside their water wheels, watching fewer and fewer wagons arrive each passing week. The atmosphere in local markets changed as well. Weekly gatherings that had once filled village squares with merchants, farmers, and travelers became strangely quiet. Many traders refused to risk dangerous roads damaged by flooding. Others managed to arrive with goods to sell, only to discover that few customers could afford them. Farmers had lost their harvests. Craftsmen had lost their buyers. Laborers who depended on seasonal work found fewer opportunities than ever before. The medieval economy functioned very differently from the modern financial world. Wealth was measured less by coins than by tangible necessities. Grain stored inside barns, healthy livestock grazing in fields, sturdy tools hanging inside workshops, and productive farmland capable of feeding a family. When natural disasters destroyed these resources, entire local economies weakened together. Even those who still possessed silver coins often discovered there was simply too little food available to purchase. As conditions worsened, families found themselves making increasingly painful decisions. Some sent younger relatives to distant towns in search of employment, hoping they might earn enough to support those left behind. Others sold their last dairy cow in exchange for a few sacks of grain. Some were forced to mortgage farmland that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. These choices carried emotional weight far beyond their financial value. Selling livestock meant fewer animals to plow fields the following spring. Losing land threatened not only the present generation, but the future security of an entire family. Once again, monasteries became essential centers of relief. Many monks did far more than pray. They prepared meals for hungry neighbors, cared for the sick, recorded the names of displaced families, and shared whatever supplies remained inside their granaries. Larger monasteries sometimes maintained gardens, orchards, and carefully managed food reserves that proved invaluable during times of crisis. Yet, even the wealthiest religious communities possessed limited resources. No single monastery could feed an entire region suffering from widespread crop failure. Several surviving medieval chronicles reveal another fascinating detail. Again and again, ordinary people struggled to understand what these disasters meant. Today, Meteorologists explain prolonged rainfall through atmospheric circulation, changing pressure systems, and regional climate patterns. Medieval farmers possessed no such knowledge. When dark clouds lingered for weeks, rivers overflowed beyond memory, or harvests repeatedly failed, many interpreted these events as signs from God. Others believed they were witnessing warnings of even greater suffering yet to come. These beliefs shaped daily life. Special religious services became increasingly common. Towns organized public processions where entire communities walked together while praying for mercy and better weather. Some people fasted voluntarily. Others donated what little they still possessed to the poor. Many confessed old sins, hoping divine forgiveness might bring relief. Historical records suggest these ceremonies served not only as acts of faith, but also as powerful ways for frightened communities to face uncertainty together. Nature, however, followed no human timetable. When the first severe cold settled across the countryside, already weakened families found themselves facing another test. Bodies weakened by poor nutrition struggled to retain warmth. Homes with limited fuel could not maintain fires throughout the night. Many people simply went to bed shortly after sunset because sharing blankets beneath heavy wool coverings conserved precious body heat more effectively than sitting beside fatting embers. Entire families often slept together in a single room. Parents, children, and grandparents shared whatever warmth they could. Privacy mattered far less than survival. The animals suffered as well. With too little hay stored for winter, cattle and sheep gradually weakened. Some households reluctantly slaughtered livestock earlier than planned because feeding them through the season had become impossible. Although this provided temporary supplies of meat, it carried serious consequences for the following year. Fewer oxen meant less power for plowing. Fewer dairy cows meant less milk, butter, and cheese. Every difficult decision solved one immediate problem while quietly creating another. This was the cruel rhythm of medieval disasters. Rarely did a single catastrophe stand alone. Floods destroyed crops. Failed harvests produced hunger. Hunger weakened the body. Weak bodies became vulnerable to disease. Then winter arrived to magnify every previous hardship. Modern historians sometimes describe this process as a cascade of disasters, a chain reaction in which each crisis creates the conditions for the next. For medieval communities, survival depended not simply upon enduring one terrible event, but upon withstanding months or even years of connected hardships. As winter deepened, silence settled across many villages. The fields lay empty beneath frost. River traffic slowed to almost nothing. Markets attracted only scattered visitors. After sunset, the distant ringing of a church bell often became the loudest sound for miles. Yet life never disappeared entirely. By the dim light of a tallow candle, a mother quietly mended her children's worn clothing. An elderly grandfather shared stories of earlier famines, reminding younger generations that difficult seasons had eventually passed before. A village carpenter repaired damaged doors and broken furniture, preparing for the day when spring would finally return. Hope had not vanished. It had simply become quieter, more patient, and far more cautious. But before that winter could come to an end, another danger was already gathering beyond the horizon. This time, it would not arrive through swollen rivers or endless rain. Instead, it would emerge from deep beneath the earth itself. Within moments, a force invisible to every living soul would reduce churches, towers, bridges, and stone homes to shattered rubble, reminding the medieval world that even the strongest buildings humanity could construct were powerless against the restless ground below. Another forgotten disaster, one remembered only in scattered chronicles and broken foundations, was about to begin. No messenger carried news of what was coming. No watchtower spotted an approaching army. No merchant arriving from distant lands warned of unusual danger. For days, life continued much as it always had. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn. Blacksmiths struck glowing iron with practiced rhythm. Farmers repaired fences damaged by the recent floods. Monks copied manuscripts beneath the quiet glow of candlelight, carefully preserving words they hoped would survive for generations. Children chased one another through narrow streets, while market stalls slowly filled with vegetables, wool, salted fish, and rough pottery. Nothing in the ordinary routines of daily life suggested that the earth itself had begun to change. Unlike storms that gathered visible clouds or rivers that gradually rose beyond their banks, earthquakes offered almost no warning to medieval communities. The ground beneath their feet felt permanent. Stone cathedrals stood as symbols of endurance. Massive castle walls had survived wars, fires, and political upheaval. Entire generations grew old believing that if anything in the world could truly be trusted, it was the solid earth beneath them. History repeatedly proved otherwise. Throughout the Middle Ages, powerful earthquakes struck regions stretching from England to Italy, from the Byzantine world to Persia, from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. Some destroyed famous cities whose names still appear in history books. Others devastated smaller towns that disappeared so completely their stories faded alongside the people who lived there. Many of these disasters are now remembered only through scattered lines written in medieval chronicles. One quiet morning, somewhere within that vast medieval world, people noticed something unusual. Dogs began barking for no obvious reason. Horses shifted nervously inside their stables. Chickens fluttered restlessly despite the calm weather. Modern scientists continue to study whether some animals can sense subtle vibrations before major earthquakes. Medieval observers certainly believed they could. Chroniclers occasionally mentioned strange animal behavior shortly before the ground began shaking. Whether these reports reflected genuine warning signs or memories reshaped after the disaster remains uncertain. What matters is that those who survived often remembered ordinary details with extraordinary clarity. Then it happened. At first, the sensation was so gentle that many mistook it for a heavy wagon passing nearby. Wooden cups rattled against tables. Hanging lanterns swayed, almost imperceptibly. Loose dust drifted down from roof beams. Some people paused in confusion. Others barely noticed. A few seconds later, the true force arrived. The ground lurched violently beneath every building. Stone walls groaned with sounds no one had ever heard before. Timber frames twisted under impossible pressure. Chimneys collapsed through rooftops. Church bells began ringing wildly, not because anyone had pulled the ropes, but because entire bell towers were shaking from side to side. People ran instinctively toward open spaces. Some never reached them. Heavy roof tiles crashed into narrow streets. Masonry broke apart without warning. Massive stones that had remained perfectly balanced for centuries suddenly lost their support. Clouds of dust swallowed entire neighborhoods, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The noise became overwhelming, not simply the crashing of buildings, but the combined sound of splitting timber, grinding stone, terrified livestock, human voices calling for loved ones, and deep rumbling rising from beneath the earth itself. For those who experienced medieval earthquakes, the sound often remained one of their strongest memories. Unlike modern cities with reinforced concrete and engineered structures, medieval towns were especially vulnerable. Stone buildings possessed tremendous strength under normal conditions, yet many lacked the flexibility needed to withstand violent movement. Mortar weakened with age. Heavy roofs placed enormous weight upon supporting walls. Tall towers, symbols of civic pride and religious devotion, became particularly dangerous when the ground refused to remain still. Churches suffered greatly. This was especially heartbreaking because they often served as the strongest buildings in town. People naturally ran toward familiar places they believed would offer safety. Instead, enormous vaulted ceilings sometimes collapsed beneath their own weight. Decorated columns cracked. Stained glass shattered into thousands of glittering fragments. Stone statues carved by craftsmen decades earlier broke apart in seconds. Yet not every building fell. Some houses survived almost untouched, while larger structures nearby became ruins. Medieval observers struggled to understand why destruction appeared so random. Entire streets might collapse, while neighboring districts remained standing. One family emerged unharmed, while another living only a short distance away lost everything. Modern geology explains much of this through differences in soil, construction methods, and the direction of seismic waves. To medieval communities, however, such patterns remained mysterious. The shaking eventually stopped. Silence did not immediately return. Instead, Cries echoed across the ruined town. Dust continued drifting through the air. Injured animals wandered without direction. Parents searched desperately for children. Children searched for parents. Neighbors called familiar names that received no answer. The first minutes after the earthquake were filled not with organized rescue efforts, but with instinctive acts of courage. People dug through fallen beams using bare hands. Carpenters grabbed axes to cut trapped survivors free. Blacksmiths used iron tools to pry apart collapsed doorways. Monks abandoned their manuscripts and hurried into damaged streets, carrying blankets, water, and whatever medical supplies they possessed. No central emergency service existed. The community itself became the rescue force. Hours passed before anyone fully understood the scale of the disaster. Entire sections of town had vanished beneath piles of broken stone. Public wells became blocked with rubble. Bridges crossing nearby rivers cracked or collapsed, isolating neighborhoods from one another. Roads leading into the city were damaged by landslides, slowing help from neighboring settlements. Even those who survived without injury faced immediate uncertainty. Where would they sleep? Where could food be stored safely? Would more buildings collapse? Those fears proved justified. Aftershocks began. Some were gentle enough to shake loose dust from damaged walls. Others caused structures already weakened by the first earthquake to collapse entirely. Every new vibration reignited panic. People who had escaped the initial destruction now refused to enter standing buildings. Families gathered in open fields despite cold temperatures, believing that tents, wagons, or simple wooden shelters offered greater safety than stone houses. Night brought little comfort. Without modern lighting, ruined towns became landscapes of darkness, interrupted only by scattered fires and flickering candles. The smell of dust mixed with smoke from collapsed hearths. Some survivors remained awake until sunrise, afraid that sleep would leave them trapped if another earthquake struck. Others quietly prayed throughout the night. Religious interpretations spread rapidly. Some viewed the earthquake as divine punishment. Others believed it marked the approach of the last judgment described in Scripture. Special prayer services were organized wherever churches remained standing. Where churches had fallen, worship continued outdoors beneath the open sky. Faith became both a source of comfort and a way of making sense of events that seemed impossible to explain. The disaster extended far beyond damaged buildings. Water systems failed. Many medieval towns depended upon carefully maintained aqueducts, springs, wooden pipes, or public wells. Earthquakes frequently disrupted these fragile networks. Fresh drinking water became difficult to obtain precisely when injuries required clean treatment. Food supplies also suffered. Granaries collapsed. Storehouses cracked open. Barrels spilled their contents across ruined streets. even when food remained available. Preparing it became difficult because ovens had been destroyed and kitchens buried beneath rubble. Disease soon threatened to follow. Crowded temporary shelters encouraged illness. Contaminated water increased the risk of infection. Open wounds became dangerous without effective medical treatment. Although medieval physicians understood surprisingly more than they are often given credit for, they possessed no knowledge of bacteria or antiseptics. Many injuries that appear survivable today became fatal simply because infection developed over the following days. The emotional burden proved equally heavy. For weeks afterward, every unexpected sound startled survivors. A heavy cart rolling across uneven ground resembled distant tremors. Strong winds rattling loose shutters caused frightened families to rush outdoors. Confidence in familiar places disappeared. Homes that had once represented security now inspired quiet suspicion. Even children altered their games, avoiding ruined buildings whose broken walls seemed ready to fall at any moment. Yet amid the destruction, remarkable resilience slowly emerged. Stone by stone, streets began to clear. Carpenters built temporary shelters. Masons inspected surviving walls, deciding what could be repaired and what must be abandoned forever. Communities that had lost nearly everything discovered that rebuilding required not only materials, but patience measured in years rather than weeks. The forgotten earthquake gradually disappeared from wider memory. Larger political events eventually filled royal chronicles. Kings continued their wars. Merchants reopened distant trade routes. New generations grew up among rebuilt streets, often unaware of how completely the previous town had vanished beneath their feet. Only cracked foundations, buried below newer buildings, quietly preserved the evidence. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover those broken walls and collapsed churches, piecing together the silent story of a disaster that once terrified thousands, but was slowly forgotten by the rest of the world. And while those survivors carefully rebuilt their lives from shattered stone, far beyond the horizon, another forgotten medieval catastrophe was already beginning. Not beneath the earth this time, but high above it, where subtle changes in climate would quietly transform harvests, reshape kingdoms, and leave millions wondering why the seasons no longer behaved as they always had. For a time, the rebuilding continued with cautious optimism. Collapsed homes slowly gave way to new foundations. Roads were cleared one cartload of rubble at a time. Bells once buried beneath broken towers were recovered and rehung wherever new wooden frames could support them. Markets gradually reopened, although many stalls displayed fewer goods than they once had. Life did not return all at once. Instead, it crept forward through thousands of ordinary decisions made by ordinary people determined to continue. Then something changed again. Unlike the earthquake, This new disaster announced itself with no dramatic moment. There was no deafening roar, no collapsing walls, and no single day that people would later point to as the beginning. It unfolded so gradually that many failed to recognize it until its consequences had already become impossible to escape. The seasons no longer behaved as they should. Spring arrived late. Summer remained strangely cool. Autumn brought rain at unusual times. Winter seemed reluctant to leave. At first, these changes appeared to be little more than bad luck. Every farming community expected occasional years of disappointing weather. Medieval people understood that nature was unpredictable. They had always accepted that some harvests would be better than others. But this was different. Year after year, familiar patterns refused to return. Fields that normally ripened beneath warm sunshine remained damp for weeks. Grain struggled to mature before the first autumn frosts arrived. Hay dried too slowly to store properly, leaving livestock with poor quality feed throughout the winter. Fruit trees produced smaller harvests, while vineyards in some regions yielded grapes that never fully ripened. Modern historians and climate scientists have spent decades studying this forgotten period of environmental instability. Tree rings, ice cores, lake sediments, and surviving medieval records all point toward years when cooler temperatures and relentless rainfall combined to produce widespread agricultural failure. Individual communities understood only their local experience, but together their stories reveal a much larger pattern stretching across enormous parts of Europe. The people living through it had no way of seeing that broader picture. A farmer in northern France could not know that villagers in England faced similar hardships. A monastery in the Alps knew nothing of struggling harvests hundreds of miles away. Communication remained slow, and most people rarely traveled far beyond their own region. Each community believed its suffering might be unique. In reality, countless others faced the same quiet disaster. The first warning often appeared during planting. Fields remained too wet for horses and oxen to work efficiently. Heavy plows became trapped in thick mud. Farmers waited for the ground to dry, losing valuable weeks. Every delayed planting shortened the growing season, reducing the chances of a successful harvest before winter returned. The weather offered little mercy. Clouds gathered again. Gentle rain became steady rain. Steady rain became endless rain. The medieval farmer watched the sky with increasing frustration. Every day without sunlight meant slower growth. Every additional storm washed nutrients from the soil. Small streams overflowed into fields that had only recently been planted. Seedlings disappeared beneath standing water before they had any opportunity to mature. Entire villages became trapped in a cycle of waiting, waiting for the fields to dry, waiting for the sun to return, waiting for harvest, waiting for relief. Sometimes that relief never came. When harvest season finally arrived, disappointment spread quietly across the countryside. The grain heads were smaller than usual. Many stalks had rotted before they could be cut. Others had fallen flat after repeated storms, making them difficult to gather. Workers spent longer in the fields, collecting significantly less food. The difference seemed modest at first. Perhaps one family harvested 10% less than expected. Another lost 20%. A neighboring village suffered even greater losses. By themselves, these reductions appeared manageable. Together, they became catastrophic. Every medieval community relied upon surplus food. Successful harvests did more than feed people through the coming winter. They provided seed for the following spring, feed for livestock, taxes for local lords, tithes for churches, and goods for trade. When harvests shrank, every part of society felt the consequences. Grain merchants noticed the change almost immediately. The wagons arriving from farming villages carried lighter loads. Millstones turned less frequently. Storage barns that should have been overflowing by autumn stood half empty. Prices began to rise. Not overnight. Slowly, steadily, each week, bread became slightly more expensive. Barley cost a little more than before. Oats followed the same pattern. Families adjusted as best they could. Loaves became smaller. Porridge grew thinner. Meat appeared less often on the table. People gathered edible herbs, wild berries, mushrooms, and nuts whenever possible, supplementing their shrinking supplies with whatever nature still provided. Those living near rivers increased their fishing. Those near forests searched for game. But natural resources had limits. As more people depended upon them, those resources became increasingly difficult to find. The forests themselves reflected these growing pressures. Dead branches disappeared quickly as families searched desperately for firewood. Small animals that had once been common became noticeably scarcer. Even birds' nests were sometimes raided for eggs long before the chicks could hatch. Survival encouraged decisions that few people would have considered during prosperous years. Livestock represented another growing concern. Healthy animals required large quantities of hay throughout the winter. Poor harvests meant fewer hayfields, produced adequate supplies. Farmers faced impossible choices: feed the animals and reduce food for the family, or preserve food for the household while allowing valuable livestock to weaken. Many reluctantly chose to slaughter animals before winter rather than watch them starve. The decision made practical sense. It also carried painful consequences. A cow provided milk every day. An ox pulled the plow each spring. Sheep supplied wool year after year. Once these animals disappeared, rebuilding prosperity became far more difficult. The shortage extended beyond food. Textile production slowed because fewer sheep survived. Leather became more expensive as cattle numbers declined. Transportation suffered because fewer horses remained healthy enough for long journeys. One poor harvest gradually affected industries that seemed completely unrelated to farming. Medieval society functioned as an interconnected system. Every part depended upon the stability of another. Monasteries carefully documented these difficult years. Unlike many ordinary villagers, monks often maintained written records describing unusual weather, failed harvests, rising prices, and widespread hardship. Their chronicles rarely contained dramatic emotional language. Instead, they recorded events with remarkable simplicity. The rains did not cease. The harvest was poor. There was great hunger. Those brief sentences now provide historians with priceless evidence. Behind every understated line lay thousands of untold stories. Children going to bed hungry, parents pretending they were not hungry so younger family members could eat, travelers walking from village to village hopping to find work or food, communities sharing what little remained because they understood that isolation offered no protection. Not everyone responded with generosity. Scarcity often exposed both the best and worst qualities of human nature. Some merchants honestly sold grain at fair prices despite growing demand. Others hoarded supplies, waiting for prices to climb even higher. A few wealthy landowners reduced rents to help struggling tenants remain on their farms. Others insisted upon collecting every payment regardless of hardship. The medieval world contained kindness and selfishness in equal measure. Disaster merely made both easier to see. Across much of Europe, the weather continued its slow assault upon ordinary life. This forgotten climate crisis lacked the dramatic imagery of famous battles or devastating plagues. No armies marched, no castles burned, no conquering king appeared. Instead, millions found themselves defeated by something far more ordinary. Clouds, rain, cold, and seasons that no longer followed the rhythm their grandparents had always trusted. People could endure one difficult year. Many could survive two. But as the pattern stretched onward, quiet concern slowly transformed into genuine fear. For some communities, the worst was still ahead, because prolonged hunger weakens more than the body. It weakens resistance to disease. It weakens economies. It weakens governments. And before long, another forgotten medieval disaster would emerge, not from the sky or the earth, but from the desperate choices people made when survival itself became uncertain. Hunger changes a community in ways that are not immediately visible. It does not always announce itself through empty streets or dramatic scenes of desperation. More often, it appears quietly. Conversations become shorter. Smiles become less frequent. Market stalls open later and close earlier because there is little left to sell. Families begin locking away even the smallest stores of grain, not out of selfishness, but because uncertainty makes every handful of food feel precious. In prosperous years, medieval villages depended upon cooperation. Neighbors borrowed tools from one another. Families exchanged labor during planting and harvest. Millers often trusted familiar customers to settle small debts after the harvest had been gathered. When food became scarce, these ordinary relationships grew more complicated. Trust itself became another limited resource. People who had always shared generously found themselves calculating exactly how much they could afford to give away. Refusing a request for bread did not necessarily reflect cruelty. Sometimes it reflected the painful reality that feeding another family today might leave one's own children hungry next month. Village leaders faced impossible decisions. Who should receive the remaining grain? Should scarce supplies be reserved for children? Should elderly residents receive equal portions despite their reduced ability to work? Should seed grain be protected for the following spring, even while people were hungry now? Every answer solved one problem while creating another. There were no perfect choices. The medieval world possessed no national emergency food reserves, no refrigerated transport, and no organized disaster relief agencies capable of moving enormous quantities of supplies across entire regions. Help depended largely upon local resources, nearby monasteries, charitable nobles, or fortunate harvests elsewhere. Sometimes that help arrived, sometimes it did not. As winter gradually loosened its grip, people naturally looked toward spring with cautious hope. A new planting season offered another opportunity, another chance, another beginning. Yet hope alone could not repair damaged farmland or replace seed that had already been eaten during the winter. Many farmers now faced an agonizing dilemma. The grain saved for planting represented the future. The grain stored inside the kitchen represented survival today. Every handful consumed reduced the coming harvest. Every handful preserved increased present hunger. Some families resisted the temptation, protecting their seed despite empty stomachs. Others simply could not. Parents watching hungry children often chose immediate survival over uncertain prosperity months away. History offers little reason to judge them harshly. Few people make ideal decisions when confronted with starvation. The spring that followed proved disappointing once again. Heavy rains delayed planting across many regions. Fields remained saturated. Oxen struggled through deep mud. Wooden plows clogged repeatedly with wet soil. Work that normally required days stretched into weeks. Every delay shortened the growing season. Every shortened season increased the risk of another poor harvest. The cycle continued. Medieval chroniclers occasionally described these years with remarkable restraint. One monk simply noted that the earth yielded little. Another wrote that bread became dear. A third observed that many wandered seeking food. Behind those understated sentences lay extraordinary suffering. Entire households left the villages where their families had lived for generations. They traveled unfamiliar roads, hoping conditions might be better elsewhere. Some reached prosperous towns, willing to offer temporary work. Others discovered that neighboring regions faced exactly the same hardships. Roads became crowded with travelers carrying everything they still possessed: a small cart, a few blankets, simple cooking pots, perhaps a goat or a single surviving cow. These journeys rarely resembled adventurous travel. They reflected necessity. Many medieval people spent their entire lives within a relatively small area. Leaving home represented one of the most difficult decisions imaginable. Everything familiar disappeared: the local church, the nearby river, neighbors known since childhood, family graves, the fields where generations had worked together. Disaster forced people to abandon not merely property, but identity itself. Large towns noticed these newcomers almost immediately. More people searched for employment. More families requested charity. More children appeared beside church doors, asking for food. Municipal authorities struggled to respond. Some cities welcomed newcomers, believing additional labor would eventually strengthen the local economy. Others feared overcrowding, rising prices, or increasing disorder. Policies varied widely from place to place. No universal solution existed. Trade also suffered unexpected consequences. Merchants normally traveled predictable routes, linking villages, towns, monasteries, and ports. Poor harvests disrupted those networks. Regions producing little surplus grain exported less. Caravans became smaller. Some trading journeys no longer generated enough profit to justify the risk. Markets that once displayed spices, cloth, metal tools, salt, wine, and grain from distant regions became noticeably less diverse. Economic life slowed almost imperceptibly. Yet across months and years, the cumulative effect became substantial. Craftsmen found fewer customers. Blacksmiths produced fewer plows because farmers postponed replacing worn equipment. Weavers sold less cloth because families prioritized food above new clothing. Carpenters received fewer requests for new houses when surviving existing homes became challenge enough. One failed harvest influenced occupations that seemed entirely unrelated to agriculture. This interconnectedness often surprises modern readers. The medieval economy lacked the complexity of modern industrial societies. Yet, it remained deeply dependent upon successful farming. Agriculture formed the foundation, supporting almost everything else. Remove that foundation, and countless other activities gradually weakened. Nature introduced another complication. Poor nutrition affected more than strength. It reduced resistance to illness. Minor infections lingered longer. Small injuries healed more slowly. ordinary seasonal diseases spread more easily among undernourished populations. Physicians observed these patterns even though they lacked modern scientific explanations. Many recognized that weakened bodies struggled to recover. Their treatments reflected the medical knowledge available at the time. Herbal remedies, rest, careful diets whenever food permitted. Prayer often accompanied medicine rather than replacing it. Some treatments undoubtedly offered comfort. Others proved ineffective. None could fully overcome widespread hunger. Children suffered especially severe consequences. Growing bodies required regular nourishment. Years of poor harvests left lasting effects upon physical development. Archaeologists studying medieval cemeteries have occasionally found evidence of nutritional stress preserved within bones and teeth. These silent remains reveal stories that written chronicles rarely recorded. Not every consequence appeared immediately. Some children survived the difficult years, only to carry their experiences throughout adulthood. Smaller stature, reduced health, lingering weakness. Disasters often cast shadows, extending far beyond the years in which they occurred. Despite these hardships, daily routines continued wherever possible. Church bells still marked the hours. Markets still opened. Marriages still took place. Children still played whenever opportunities arose. Life rarely stopped completely. Instead, it adapted. People learned to celebrate modest successes. A healthy calf born in spring, a field drying sooner than expected, a successful fishing trip, a wagon safely returning from a distant market. Small victories acquired enormous significance. Communities also became remarkably inventive. Farmers experimented with hardier crops wherever local conditions allowed. Villagers improved drainage ditches to remove standing water from fields. Some monasteries introduced new agricultural techniques learned through correspondence with distant religious houses. Knowledge traveled slowly, but it did travel. Necessity encouraged innovation long before scientific agriculture emerged. Looking back across centuries, it becomes easy to summarize these years with simple phrases: a period of poor harvests, a medieval famine, a climate crisis. Such descriptions contain truth. They also conceal countless individual lives. History remembers disasters through dates and statistics. The people who lived through them experienced something entirely different. They remembered faces, voices, empty tables, long winters, the smell of damp grain, the relief of finally seeing clear skies after weeks of relentless rain, the quiet joy of harvesting even a modest crop after years of disappointment. These ordinary memories rarely appear in official chronicles, yet they formed the true human experience of medieval disaster. As conditions slowly began to stabilize in some regions, people naturally hoped the worst had finally passed. Fields looked greener. Markets displayed slightly more goods. Travel became easier as roads dried. The future once again seemed imaginable. But history has a habit of testing optimism. Far to the north, where cold seas met low-lying coastlines protected only by fragile dunes and simple earthen barriers, another forgotten catastrophe was already gathering strength. This one would arrive with the tide, and before a single sunrise had fully broken across the horizon, entire villages would vanish beneath the sea, leaving behind little more than scattered legends and the quiet memory of church bells that, according to later generations, could still be heard ringing beneath the waves. The sea had always been both a generous neighbor and a patient enemy. For generations, coastal communities depended upon it for nearly everything. Fishing boats left before sunrise, returning with herring, cod, shellfish, and countless smaller catches that filled village markets. Salt marshes provided grazing land for sheep. Busy ports connected distant kingdoms, carrying wool, timber, grain, wine, and cloth across the cold waters of the North Sea and the Baltic. To the people living there, the ocean was not simply a body of water. It was their livelihood, their highway, their pantry, their future. Yet everyone understood that the sea demanded constant respect. Unlike the towering mountains or deep forests farther inland, coastlines never truly remained still. Tides rose and fell every day. Sandbars shifted after powerful storms. Narrow channels opened where none had existed before. Small islands slowly changed shape over decades. Medieval fishermen noticed these gradual transformations because their survival depended upon reading the water correctly. Most years, these changes remained manageable. Villagers repaired damaged dikes after winter storms. Farmers reinforced earthen embankments, protecting valuable farmland from saltwater. Families gathered driftwood, carried ashore by rough seas. The work never ended. Maintaining the coastline became an ordinary part of everyday life. Many settlements existed only because generations of labor had slowly reclaimed land from the sea. Across parts of the Low Countries and the North Sea coast, communities built simple but remarkably effective systems of dikes, drainage canals, and embankments. Without constant maintenance, much of this land would quickly return to marshes and tidal flats. It was an impressive achievement. It was also extraordinarily fragile. The defenses protecting thousands of people were often built from packed earth, timber, woven branches, and grass. These materials performed surprisingly well under normal conditions. They could survive ordinary storms, seasonal flooding, and the regular rhythm of tides, but they were never designed to withstand the extraordinary. The warning signs appeared several days before disaster struck. Experienced sailors noticed the wind behaving differently. The air felt unusually heavy. Clouds moved in unfamiliar patterns across the horizon. seabirds abandoned their normal feeding grounds, flying inland in unusually large numbers. None of these signs guaranteed catastrophe. Storms were common. Autumn frequently brought rough weather. Most families simply secured loose equipment, checked the condition of their boats, and continued with their work. As evening approached, the wind strengthened. Fishing vessels returned earlier than usual. Their captains preferred spending an uncomfortable night ashore rather than risking open water after dark. Along the coastline, mothers hurried children indoors. Farmers made certain livestock were safely enclosed. Doors were secured. Shutters were fastened. Fires were built a little larger than usual in preparation for a cold night. After sunset, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against rooftops with relentless force. Strong gusts rattled wooden walls. Trees bent dramatically beneath the pressure of the wind. Still, most people remained calm. They had survived storms before. Many older residents could remember nights that seemed equally frightening. Experience suggested that by morning, the worst would likely have passed. Shortly after midnight, everything changed. The wind shifted. Instead of blowing along the coastline, it drove directly toward the land. Far out at sea, powerful winds pushed enormous volumes of water toward the coast faster than the tides could naturally retreat. The sea began rising. At first, the increase appeared modest. Water reached slightly higher against harbor walls. Waves spilled over familiar rocks that normally remained exposed. Watchmen noticed the unusually high tide and alerted nearby households. Some villagers left their homes to inspect the shoreline. Few understood what they were seeing. Storm surges differ from ordinary tides. The ocean itself is lifted by wind and atmospheric pressure, creating walls of water capable of overwhelming coastlines with astonishing speed. Modern forecasting systems can often predict these events days in advance. Medieval communities possessed only observation and experience. Sometimes experience was not enough. The first dike failed without warning. Hours of pounding waves had gradually weakened its outer face. Then one section suddenly collapsed. A narrow opening appeared. Seawater rushed through with incredible force. Instead of slowing, the escaping water rapidly widened the breach. Packed earth dissolved beneath the current. Timbers snapped. Grass-covered embankments disappeared into swirling water. Within minutes, the opening had become impossible to repair. The sea poured inland. Another dike failed farther down the coast. Then another. Each collapse increased the volume of water racing toward villages that had stood safely behind these barriers for generations. People awoke to unfamiliar sounds. Not thunder, not rain, but the deep, continuous roar of moving water. Those living closest to the shoreline opened their doors, only to find seawater already flowing through the streets. Some immediately climbed onto rooftops, Others rushed toward higher ground carrying sleeping children wrapped in blankets. Many attempted to release livestock before the rising water trapped them inside barns. Time disappeared. Every minute mattered. The flood spread with terrifying speed. Unlike river floods that often rise gradually, storm surges can transform dry land into open water within a remarkably short period. Fields vanished beneath waves. Roads disappeared completely. Wooden fences floated away. Fishing boats broke free from their moorings and crashed into buildings. Entire houses, especially lighter timber structures, were lifted from their foundations before breaking apart in the current. Darkness made everything worse. Without electric lights, survivors struggled to judge the depth of the water or identify safe routes. People navigated largely by memory. Where had the road been? Where was the church? Where did the ground begin rising? Landmarks disappeared beneath the flood. Familiar places became unrecognizable. Families were separated in the confusion. Some reached church towers, believing the stone buildings offered the strongest refuge. Others climbed large trees. A few escaped aboard small boats that had remained tied near their homes. Many had no opportunity to escape at all. The storm continued until dawn. Only as daylight slowly spread across the flooded landscape did survivors begin to understand the scale of the destruction. Entire villages had vanished. Fields carefully cultivated for generations now resembled shallow seas. Livestock floated among broken beams and shattered wagons. Churches stood isolated like small islands rising above endless water. Where roads had connected neighboring settlements only yesterday, there was now nothing but open water stretching toward the horizon. Rescue efforts began immediately. Fishermen who had survived launched their boats. Once the worst of the storm had passed, they searched rooftops, church towers, clusters of trees, any place where survivors might still be waiting. Many rescues succeeded. Many arrived too late. Those brought to safety often carried nothing except the clothing they wore. Everything else had disappeared beneath the sea. The emotional toll proved impossible to measure. Some families lost homes. Others lost farms. Many lost relatives whose bodies were never recovered. Without graves to visit, mourning became strangely incomplete. Stories filled the silence left behind. In later centuries, legends spread throughout parts of northern Europe, describing drowned villages resting beneath the sea. According to local tradition, fishermen on calm days could sometimes hear church bells ringing faintly beneath the waves. No historical evidence supports such tales, yet legends often preserve emotional truths, even when literal details cannot be confirmed. The memory of entire communities disappearing was so profound that later generations struggled to imagine those villages simply gone forever. They created stories that allowed the lost settlements to remain part of the landscape. Modern archaeology has revealed that these traditions were not entirely without foundation. Along parts of the North Sea coast, researchers have discovered the remains of medieval settlements now submerged beneath coastal waters or buried beneath thick layers of sediment. Broken walls, fragments of pottery, timber foundations, the outlines of fields that once produced grain where fish now swim. These discoveries remind us that coastlines are living landscapes, constantly changing over centuries. The people who lived there understood this better than anyone. Still, no amount of experience could fully prepare them for a storm powerful enough to redraw the map itself. As the floodwaters slowly receded, survivors faced an impossible question. Should they rebuild where generations of their families had lived? Or should they abandon the coast forever and begin new lives farther inland? Some chose to stay. They constructed stronger dikes, raised houses upon higher ground, worked together to reclaim the flooded land once again. Others never returned. Their abandoned villages gradually disappeared beneath shifting sand, marsh grass, and the slow advance of the sea. Centuries later, only scattered records and archaeological discoveries would reveal that thriving medieval communities had ever existed there at all. Yet even as these coastal survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, another forgotten disaster was quietly unfolding far to the east. This one would not be carried by water or wind. It would travel silently along the trade routes themselves, hidden inside wagons, ships, and caravans, beginning with something so small that no medieval eye could possibly see it. Long before anyone recognized the approach of the Black Death, medieval societies had already endured numerous forgotten epidemics that rarely appear in modern history books. These outbreaks never reached the devastating scale of the plague that would later sweep across continents. Yet, for the communities that experienced them, the suffering felt no less overwhelming. Entire villages sometimes lost a generation of elders within a single season. Monasteries that had carefully preserved knowledge for centuries suddenly found themselves with only a handful of surviving brothers. Small towns watched familiar faces disappear one by one, leaving empty workshops, silent homes, and unanswered church bells. The tragedy was not simply the number of lives lost. It was the uncertainty. People could see illness spreading. They simply could not understand why. A traveler arrived from another town, feeling slightly tired. A merchant developed a fever after returning from a distant market. A child began coughing several days after attending a village festival. At first, these events appeared unrelated. Illness was part of medieval life. Most families expected to experience periods of sickness each year. Colds, stomach ailments, infected wounds, and seasonal fevers were common companions in an age without antibiotics or modern sanitation. People recovered from many of these illnesses through rest, careful nursing, herbal remedies, and simple good fortune. But occasionally, something far more dangerous arrived. It often began quietly. One household became ill. A neighboring family followed. Within days, several streets reported similar symptoms. No one knew whether the sickness traveled through the air, contaminated water, spoiled food, or direct contact. Medieval medicine drew upon centuries of observation, inherited from Greek, Roman, Arabic, and local traditions. Physicians carefully examined patients, recorded symptoms, and recommended treatments based upon the knowledge available to them. Contrary to popular myth, medieval doctors were not simply guessing. Many possessed considerable practical experience. They understood that clean surroundings often benefited recovery. They encouraged balanced diets whenever food was available. Some recognized that certain diseases appeared to spread between people, even if the exact mechanism remained unknown. What they lacked was the invisible world revealed centuries later through microscopes. They could not see bacteria. They could not identify viruses. The true causes of many epidemics remained hidden. In one market town, the illness first appeared among travelers. The weekly market attracted merchants from dozens of surrounding villages. Wagons filled with grain, wool, pottery, leather, timber, and salted fish crowded the narrow streets. Buyers and sellers shook hands, exchanged coins, shared meals, and rested together at crowded inns before beginning their journeys home. Markets represented the lifeblood of the medieval economy. They also created ideal conditions for contagious diseases. Hundreds of people gathered closely together. Animals stood beside humans. Food was prepared in busy public spaces. Travelers carried unfamiliar illnesses from distant regions without realizing it. No one intended harm. Commerce simply connected people. Disease quietly followed those same connections. The first victims often dismissed their symptoms. A mild fever, a persistent headache, fatigue after what had seemed an ordinary journey. Most continued working. A blacksmith could not simply abandon his forge because he felt slightly unwell. Farmers still needed to care for livestock. Millers still ground grain. Daily responsibilities continued despite growing discomfort. Within several days, conditions worsened. High fevers confined people to bed. Violent chills alternated with burning heat. Some patients developed severe coughs. Others complained of intense pain throughout their bodies. Many lost their appetite completely. Family members gathered beside their beds, offering water, broth, and whatever herbal preparations local healers recommended. They hoped rest would bring recovery. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. As more households reported similar illnesses, anxiety spread almost as quickly as the disease itself. Churches organized prayers for the sick. Monasteries opened their infirmaries to those requiring care. Local physicians traveled from home to home despite knowing they themselves risked becoming ill. Their courage often went unnoticed. They continued working because someone had to. Caregiving fell largely upon ordinary families. Mothers remained awake through the night, cooling burning foreheads with damp cloths. Older siblings cared for younger children while parents recovered. Neighbors delivered firewood or fresh water to households unable to leave their homes. Communities often survived not because medicine cured every illness, but because compassion remained stronger than fear. Yet fear certainly existed. Rumors traveled rapidly. Some believed poisoned wells caused the sickness. Others suspected unusual weather. Many interpreted the outbreak through religious beliefs, viewing it as either a test of faith or a call to repentance. Without scientific explanations, people naturally searched for meaning wherever they could find it. The outbreak gradually affected the town's economy. Shops opened irregularly. Market attendance declined. Travelers postponed journeys unless absolutely necessary. Some merchants refused to enter communities known to be experiencing illness. Trade slowed. Income disappeared. Families already weakened by previous years of poor harvests found themselves facing another challenge. Food became harder to obtain precisely when proper nutrition mattered most. The cemetery expanded quietly. Funerals became more frequent. Church bells rang with increasing regularity. Each service gathered grieving relatives who struggled to maintain hope despite witnessing repeated loss. Unlike modern hospitals, medieval communities rarely separated the sick from the healthy in systematic ways. Care occurred inside family homes. This strengthened emotional bonds. It also allowed contagious illnesses to spread more easily among relatives. Some monasteries unintentionally suffered particularly heavy losses. Monks lived, prayed, ate, and worked together in close quarters. Once illness entered the community, it often moved rapidly from one brother to another. The same closeness that strengthened spiritual life also increased vulnerability during epidemics. Despite these hardships, remarkable acts of resilience continued. Healthy neighbors harvested crops for families unable to work. Local bakers donated bread whenever flour remained available. Carpenters built simple coffins without requesting immediate payment. Priests comforted both the dying and those left behind. History often remembers disasters through numbers. The people who lived them remembered names. A familiar merchant, no longer standing in the market square. The village teacher, whose lessons suddenly ended. The elderly woman, who had delivered countless bobbies over decades of service. The shepherd, whose whistle no longer echoed across nearby hills. Communities measured loss through absence. Eventually, the outbreak began to fade. Fewer new cases appeared. Recovered patients slowly regained their strength. Markets cautiously reopened. Children returned to playing in village lanes. Fields once again filled with workers preparing for another growing season. Life resumed, not because everything had returned to normal, but because people had little choice. Survival required moving forward. Years later, another illness would come, then another. Most remained local. Some spread across wider regions. Nearly all were eventually overshadowed by the arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century. A catastrophe so enormous that it dominated historical memory and pushed countless earlier epidemics into obscurity. Yet those forgotten outbreaks mattered. They shaped medical practice. They influenced religious life. They changed family structures. They reminded medieval societies that unseen dangers could travel more quickly than armies and leave deeper scars than many wars. As memories of the epidemic gradually softened, roads filled once again with merchants carrying goods across kingdoms. Ships resumed their regular voyages. Caravans crossed mountain passes. Trade flourished where peace allowed. To many, prosperity appeared ready to return. But hidden beneath that renewed confidence was another vulnerability, one that had nothing to do with disease, weather, or earthquakes. It lay inside the medieval economy itself. For in the years ahead, entire regions would discover that even without floodwaters, failing harvests, or epidemics, a society could still be pushed toward disaster by something as ordinary as the slow collapse of trust, commerce, and the fragile systems that held everyday life together. Prosperity has always been more delicate than it appears. A bustling marketplace can give the impression that everything is secure. Wagons arrive loaded with grain. Fishing boats return with full nets. Blacksmiths shape glowing iron from dawn until dusk. Inns fill with travelers exchanging stories from distant kingdoms. Coins pass from one hand to another with reassuring regularity. From the outside, such places seem immune to hardship. Yet beneath the surface, medieval economies depended upon countless fragile connections. A bridge needed to remain standing. A road had to remain safe. Harvests had to produce enough surplus to support trade. Merchants had to believe that distant buyers could afford their goods. If enough of those connections weakened at the same time, prosperity could disappear with surprising speed. Unlike an earthquake or a flood, economic disasters rarely left dramatic ruins behind. No towering walls collapsed. No forests caught fire. No villages vanished beneath the sea. Instead, workshops gradually fell silent. Market squares became quieter each passing season. Travelers arrived less frequently. Entire occupations slowly disappeared, often without anyone recognizing the pattern until years had passed. One forgotten example began along a well-traveled trade route connecting several prosperous towns. For generations, merchants had followed the same roads. Some transported wool from farming districts to busy weaving centers. Others carried barrels of salt that preserved meat throughout the winter. Blacksmiths purchased iron brought from distant mines. Monasteries ordered parchment, candles, and carefully copied manuscripts. The movement of goods appeared almost effortless. In reality, it depended upon remarkable organization. Every wagon required healthy horses. Every horse required feed. Roads demanded constant maintenance. Bridges needed repairs after floods. Local rulers collected tolls while promising protection from bandits. Innkeepers provided food and shelter to travelers. Millers produced flour for both local families and passing merchants. Hundreds of ordinary jobs quietly supported long-distance trade. Then, little by little, those connections began to weaken. It started with the roads. Years of unusually wet weather had softened the ground beneath heavily traveled routes. Deep ruts formed where wagon wheels repeatedly passed through thick mud. Small wooden bridges deteriorated faster than local communities could repair them. In some places, streams changed course after repeated flooding, washing away sections of road that had existed for generations. Travel became slower. A journey that once required 4 days now demanded 6. 6 days gradually became 8. Every additional day increased expenses. Horses consumed more feed. Drivers required more food. Wagons suffered greater wear. Profit margins quietly disappeared. Merchants began reconsidering familiar routes. Some traveled less frequently. Others stopped altogether. The effects spread outward, almost unnoticed. A village blacksmith, who normally repaired passing wagons, suddenly found fewer customers. The nearby inn served fewer evening meals. Farmers sold less hay because fewer horses stopped overnight. Tiny changes accumulated month after month. No single business collapsed overnight. Instead, each earned just a little less than before. The local market reflected these subtle shifts. Goods that had once arrived from distant regions became increasingly rare. Fine cloth appeared only occasionally. Imported wine became an expensive luxury. Salt, essential for preserving food, sometimes arrived weeks later than expected. Ordinary people adapted as best they could. Families repaired old clothing rather than purchasing new garments. Broken wooden tools were carefully mended instead of replaced. Household items remained in use long after they should have worn out. Necessity encouraged remarkable resourcefulness. Nothing useful was wasted. Even worn leather might become patches for shoes. Broken pottery occasionally found new purpose, storing seeds or animal feed. Wood from abandoned buildings became fuel or construction material elsewhere. The medieval world excelled at reuse long before modern recycling existed. Yet careful thrift could not solve every problem. Trade depended upon confidence. A merchant loading valuable cargo needed to believe buyers awaited at the journey's end. A farmer planting additional acreage expected someone would purchase the surplus. An apprentice devoted years to learning a craft because future demand appeared reliable. Once uncertainty entered the system, people naturally became cautious. Caution itself gradually slowed economic activity. Loans became harder to obtain. Investments in new workshops declined. Construction projects were postponed. Large stone churches that had taken decades to build occasionally progressed more slowly because donations decreased during difficult years. Some ambitious plans remained unfinished for generations. Political instability sometimes made matters worse. A dispute between neighboring lords could temporarily close an important road. New tolls increased transportation costs. Armed escorts became necessary through uncertain territories. Even short interruptions created ripple effects, extending far beyond the original conflict. Merchants preferred predictable routes. Uncertainty encouraged avoidance. Certain market towns gradually lost the importance they had enjoyed for centuries. Travelers simply found easier alternatives elsewhere. For local residents, the consequences unfolded slowly. The weekly market attracted fewer visitors. Young apprentices departed in search of opportunities elsewhere. Vacant workshops remained empty. Houses once occupied by prosperous craftsmen stood abandoned, or were divided into smaller homes for poorer families. No single dramatic event marked the town's decline, only the quiet passage of time. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of such changes in numerous medieval settlements. Workshops suddenly cease operating. Imported pottery becomes less common. Coin discoveries decrease. Construction slows noticeably. These silent clues reveal economic decline, even where written records remain scarce. The people living through these transitions rarely possessed the broader perspective historians enjoy today. A shoemaker simply noticed fewer customers. A merchant wondered why familiar trading partners no longer visited. A farmer questioned why grain prices fluctuated unpredictably. No individual witnessed the complete picture. Each experienced only one small part. Yet together, those individual experiences formed a much larger transformation. Remarkably, communities continued adapting. Local production became increasingly important. Villages relied more heavily upon nearby craftsmen. Regional trade replaced some longer commercial journeys. Families produced more of what they required themselves, rather than purchasing distant goods. Economic life contracted. It did not disappear. Resilience often grows quietly. One monastery established a larger vegetable garden to reduce dependence upon outside supplies. A group of neighboring villages cooperated to repair an important bridge after repeated flooding. Experienced merchants discovered alternative routes, avoiding damaged roads. Innovation frequently emerged from necessity. rather than prosperity. These forgotten recoveries deserve attention alongside the disasters themselves. History often celebrates dramatic victories, while overlooking the patient determination required simply to rebuild ordinary life. Most medieval people were not kings, generals, or famous scholars. They were individuals who woke before sunrise, worked until sunset, solved practical problems with limited resources, endured disappointments, and continued despite uncertainty. That quiet perseverance rarely appears in grand historical narratives, yet it sustained entire civilizations. By the closing years of one difficult decade, trade had begun showing cautious signs of improvement in several regions. Roads were repaired, bridges reopened, markets slowly regained confidence. Travelers once again carried news, goods, and ideas across remarkable distances. Many believed the hardest years were finally behind them. They could not know that nature still possessed one final forgotten lesson, far above the fields, forests, and market towns. Unseen changes were already unfolding in the atmosphere. Within months, the skies themselves would darken in a way few living people had ever witnessed. The sun would seem strangely weak. Summer would arrive without its usual warmth. Harvests would once again stand in jeopardy, and medieval chroniclers, searching for words to describe what they were seeing, would write of a year when daylight itself appeared somehow diminished, as though the world had briefly forgotten how to shine. At first, no one believed anything unusual was happening. The sunrise still arrived each morning. The church bells continued, marking the hours. Merchants unlocked their shops. Farmers walked into their fields, carrying familiar tools worn smooth by years of use. Life appeared reassuringly ordinary, yet subtle differences began attracting quiet attention. The dawn seemed muted, not dark, not stormy, simply less brilliant than people remembered. The afternoon sun struggled to break through a pale, hazy sky that lingered for days without producing either heavy rain or clear weather. Shadows looked softer. Colors appeared slightly duller. Even those who paid little attention to the sky occasionally remarked that something felt different. Most dismissed the thought. Perhaps it was simply an unusual season. Perhaps memories had exaggerated previous summers. After all, weather was never perfectly predictable, but the strange conditions refused to disappear. Weeks passed. The haze remained. The air felt cooler than expected for the time of year. Fields that should have been warming beneath bright sunshine stayed damp long into the morning. Dew lingered on the grass well after sunrise. Fruit trees blossomed later than normal, while vegetable gardens seemed reluctant to grow despite careful tending. The changes were small. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they began altering an entire season. Today, scientists understand that powerful volcanic eruptions can can send enormous quantities of ash and sulfur-rich particles high into the atmosphere. Carried by global air currents, these tiny particles may remain suspended for months or even years, reflecting part of the sun's energy back into space and temporarily cooling the climate far from the volcano itself. Medieval people knew nothing of atmospheric circulation. Many had never seen an active volcano, yet they occasionally lived through the consequences of eruptions occurring hundreds or even thousands of miles away. To them, the sky simply behaved in unfamiliar ways. One monastery carefully recorded that the sun appeared unusually faint. Another chronicler described persistent haze that seemed reluctant to lift. Elsewhere, writers noted unexpected frosts arriving during seasons when they should have been impossible. Each observer described only local conditions. Centuries later, historians compared these scattered accounts with geological evidence preserved inside ice cores and volcanic deposits. The stories matched remarkably well. A disaster beginning beneath a distant mountain had quietly influenced climates across much of the medieval world. The farmers, of course, knew none of this. They judged the season only by what unfolded before their eyes. Seedlings emerged more slowly. Grain remained shorter than usual. Vineyards produced fewer healthy clusters of grapes. Even hayfields, normally dependable sources of winter feed, yielded disappointing harvests. The consequences reached far beyond agriculture. Beekeepers noticed that flowering plants bloomed irregularly, reducing nectar available for honey production. Honey served not only as food, but also as the primary sweetener for many medieval households. Candle makers relied upon beeswax for high-quality church candles. One disappointing flowering season affected several trades simultaneously. Foresters observed subtle changes as well. Young trees produced slower annual growth. Wild berries ripened unevenly. Certain mushrooms appeared earlier than expected, while others scarcely appeared at all. Hunters reported that game animals shifted their usual feeding grounds in search of better forage. Nature adjusted. Human beings struggled to keep pace. Among fishermen, conversations turned toward equally puzzling observations. Some coastal waters seemed colder. Certain fish appeared later than expected. Others migrated along unfamiliar routes. No single explanation satisfied everyone. Experienced sailors trusted their own observations more than speculation. They simply sailed farther when necessary, hopping to find productive fishing grounds before returning home. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they returned with nearly empty nets. Market towns reflected these quiet disruptions. Fresh produce arrived in smaller quantities. Fruit became more expensive. Wine merchants worried about poor grape harvests. Brewers complained that lower quality barley affected the flavor of their ale. The changes rarely produced immediate disaster. Instead, they gradually reshaped expectations. People lowered their hopes one season at a time. Perhaps next year would be better. Perhaps this unusual weather would finally end. Hope remained remarkably resilient. Parents still planted gardens. Farmers still repaired fences. Millers still prepared their equipment for harvest. Life required optimism. Without it, no one would have bothered planting at all. Children, meanwhile, adapted more easily than adults. They played beneath the hazy skies without questioning why the sunlight seemed different. To them, this was simply the world as it existed. Only older generations sensed how unusual the season truly felt. Grandparents occasionally paused while looking across familiar fields. "I don't remember summers like this," one might quietly remark. Simple observations carried surprising weight. In societies where written weather records were rare, memory served as one of the most valuable sources of knowledge. When several generations agreed that conditions seemed unfamiliar, people listened carefully. Religious interpretations naturally followed. Some communities organized special days of prayer, requesting favorable weather. Others held outdoor processions through fields, asking for healthy harvests and protection from further hardship. Church leaders generally encouraged calm rather than panic, reminding congregations that difficult seasons had challenged previous generations as well. Faith offered reassurance when certainty proved impossible. Not every region suffered equally. Some areas experienced only modest cooling. Others endured repeated crop failures. The medieval world stretched across enormous distances with remarkably diverse climates. A difficult summer in one kingdom might coincide with relatively favorable conditions elsewhere. This uneven pattern complicated trade. Regions enjoying better harvests suddenly found increased demand for their surplus grain. Merchants willing to travel long distances occasionally earned considerable profits, transporting food into struggling areas. Those journeys, however, carried risks. Poor roads, bandits, political disputes, unexpected storms. Success depended as much upon fortune as skill. One particularly observant monk left behind a brief but remarkable description. He wrote that people watched the sky each day, hoping to see the familiar brightness return. The sentence contains no dramatic language, no elaborate emotion, only a simple image of ordinary people waiting for sunlight they had once taken for granted. Perhaps that is why it remains so powerful. Human beings quickly adapt to normal conditions. Only when those conditions disappear do we fully appreciate them. Eventually, the haze began to fade. The sunlight slowly regained its familiar brilliance. Warmer days returned. Fields responded with renewed growth. Not immediately. Nature required time to recover. So did the people who depended upon it. Harvests improved gradually, over the following seasons. Confidence returned little by little. Markets became busier. Travel increased. Children growing up during the brighter years heard older relatives speak about the strange summers they remembered. Some listened with fascination. Others assumed the stories had been exaggerated. Memory itself can fade surprisingly quickly. Within only a few generations, first-hand experience had become family history. Family history became local legend. Local legend gradually slipped into obscurity. The forgotten climate anomaly joined countless other medieval disasters that survived only because a handful of careful writers had chosen to record what they witnessed. Without those chronicles, we might never know that entire communities once lived beneath dimmed skies, wondering why the warmth of summer had quietly disappeared. As one mystery slowly faded into memory, another challenge was already approaching. This time, there would be no floodwaters, no collapsing buildings, no mysterious haze covering the sun. Instead, danger would arrive in the form of something entirely familiar. Bread, the very food that sustained medieval life, would soon become the center of another forgotten catastrophe, one caused not by a lack of grain alone, but by what sometimes grew upon it unnoticed, turning a daily meal into an invisible source of suffering for thousands. Bread was more than food in the medieval world. It was the center of nearly every meal. A wealthy noble might enjoy roasted game, imported spices, fresh fruit, and fine wine. But bread still occupied an honored place at the table. A village laborer, by contrast, often depended upon bread for most of the day's nourishment. Thick slices accompanied soups made from beans or onions. Smaller loaves traveled with shepherds into the hills. Bakers filled market stalls before sunrise, knowing that almost every household would visit before the morning was over. The quality of bread varied enormously. The wealthy preferred finely sifted white flour made from the best wheat. Ordinary families often baked darker loaves containing rye, barley, oats, or mixtures of several grains, depending upon local harvests. Nothing was wasted. When one crop failed, another replaced it if possible. In difficult years, flour might include peas, beans, chestnuts, or even ground acorns after careful preparation. Survival encouraged remarkable creativity, yet hardship sometimes carried hidden dangers. One of the least remembered medieval disasters began not with empty fields, but with successful harvests that concealed an unexpected threat. During unusually damp growing seasons, a strange dark fungus occasionally infected rye. To the casual observer, the grains still appeared usable. Many kernels looked perfectly ordinary. Others contained dark, elongated growths, replacing the healthy seed. Today, scientists know this fungus as asterisk ergotasterisk. Modern agriculture carefully removes contaminated grain before it reaches consumers. Medieval farmers possessed no such protection. In years when food remained plentiful, suspicious grain might simply be discarded. During times of scarcity, throwing away valuable food became almost unthinkable. Every surviving kernel mattered. The contaminated rye entered mills alongside healthy grain. Millstones crushed everything together into flour. The flour became dough. The dough became bread. Families ate what they believed would sustain them through another difficult season. At first, no one connected the illness to the bread itself. Why would they? Bread represented safety. It represented survival. Generations had relied upon it every single day. Few imagined that the very food keeping them alive could also make them desperately ill. The symptoms varied in frightening ways. Some people complained of intense burning sensations in their hands and feet. Others experienced violent muscle spasms. A few struggled to walk normally despite having suffered no visible injury. In severe cases, fingers or toes gradually darkened as blood circulation failed. The pain could become unbearable. Survivors later described sensations as though their bodies were consumed by invisible fire. Centuries afterward, historians would refer to many of these outbreaks as *** St. Anthony's fire, ***, a name reflecting both the terrible burning pain and the religious communities that later cared for many victims. For medieval observers, the illness seemed deeply mysterious. Entire households could become sick, while neighboring families remained perfectly healthy. One village suffered greatly. Another, only a few miles away, reported almost no cases at all. The pattern appeared random. Modern science reveals why. Communities eating contaminated rye developed symptoms. Those whose grain escaped infection often remained unaffected. The connection remained invisible to everyone living at the time. Physicians searched for explanations using the knowledge available to them. Some suspected unusual weather. Others blamed contaminated air. Many carefully documented the symptoms. Hopping repeated observation might reveal a pattern. Although they lacked microscopes and laboratory science, medieval doctors often approached illness with sincere curiosity rather than simple superstition. They recognized recurring symptoms. They compared cases. They debated treatments. Their conclusions sometimes missed the true cause, but their efforts reflected genuine attempts to understand the world. Religious institutions, again, played an important role. Hospitals operated by monastic communities offered care for those suffering the most severe symptoms. Among the best known were communities associated with the Order of St. Anthony, whose members became respected for treating patients afflicted by this mysterious condition. Whether through supportive care, improved nutrition, or simple removal from contaminated food sources, some patients recovered remarkably well after reaching these institutions. Others did not. The illness left lasting impressions upon those who witnessed it. A farmer who had spent decades working the same fields suddenly found walking almost impossible. A baker who prepared bread every morning could no longer grip heavy wooden tools. Children watched parents struggle with pain they could neither understand nor relieve. Families searched desperately for explanations. The social effects extended beyond health. Rumors spread quickly. Some villages questioned whether certain wells had become poisoned. Others whispered about curses or unexplained divine punishment. Travelers occasionally carried exaggerated stories from one region to another, making the outbreak appear even more frightening than it already was. Fear has always traveled faster than certainty. Merchants encountered unexpected difficulties. Communities experiencing unexplained illness sometimes received fewer visitors. People postponed journeys unless absolutely necessary. Markets became quieter, reducing trade at precisely the moment struggling families needed income the most. Economic hardship and disease reinforced one another. Yet, just as with so many forgotten medieval disasters, resilience quietly emerged. Experienced farmers gradually noticed something curious. Certain fields seemed associated with poor grain more often than others. Millers became increasingly cautious when examining unusually dark kernels. Some bakers learned through experience that grain from one harvest produced healthier bread than grain from another. No one understood the fungus responsible. Still, practical observation slowly improved survival. Knowledge often grows long before science explains why it works. Generations accumulated experience. Communities remembered which harvests had caused trouble. Certain farming practices gradually changed. Better storage reduced moisture. More careful sorting removed obviously damaged grain whenever supplies permitted. These improvements developed slowly across centuries, rather than appearing all at once. History often celebrates dramatic discoveries. Real progress frequently arrives through countless small observations made by ordinary people. The forgotten bread crisis illustrates another important truth about medieval life. Not every disaster arrived from outside. Some emerged quietly from within the routines people trusted most. A familiar meal, a trusted harvest, a daily habit repeated without fear for generations. Danger does not always appear unfamiliar. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary life. Archaeological discoveries and careful study of historical records have gradually revealed how widespread these outbreaks may have been. Although famous wars and royal successions dominate many medieval chronicles, local documents occasionally preserve heartbreaking details about mysterious illnesses affecting farming communities, whose names have long since disappeared from maps. Each brief record represents lives interrupted, meals left unfinished, harvests abandoned, families forever changed. Eventually, conditions improved. Healthier harvests reduced contamination. Knowledge accumulated. Communities unknowingly adapted to a danger they never fully understood. The mysterious illness slowly faded from many regions, surviving mostly as scattered references preserved inside monastic records and local traditions. Centuries later, scientists would finally identify the tiny organism responsible. The medieval victims never received that explanation. They endured the suffering without knowing its source. Perhaps that is one of the quiet tragedies repeated throughout history. Human beings often survive disasters long before they understand them, as healthier harvests gradually returned and villages regained confidence in their daily bread. Life once again settled into familiar rhythms. Fields ripened beneath calmer skies. Markets grew busier. Children born after the difficult years listened with disbelief as older relatives recalled strange illnesses linked to seasons no one wished to remember. Many assumed such stories belonged to the distant past. Yet history rarely allows long periods of uninterrupted peace. Far beyond the cultivated fields of Europe, across caravan routes stretching toward the great deserts and mountain passes of Asia, another forgotten medieval catastrophe was beginning to unfold. This one would not destroy crops or poison bread. Instead, it would silence one of the world's greatest trade networks, leaving prosperous cities strangely quiet as merchants discovered that sometimes the most dangerous journey was not the longest one, but the one no one returned from. For centuries, the great trade routes linking Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Far East had carried far more than silk, spices, precious metals, and fine ceramics. They carried ideas, languages, religious beliefs, scientific knowledge, stories. A merchant leaving the Mediterranean might eventually meet traders who had crossed deserts stretching thousands of miles farther east. Goods exchanged hands countless times before reaching their final destinations. A bolt of silk, woven in one kingdom, could pass through dozens of markets before finally appearing in a wealthy household on the opposite side of the continent. These routes never belonged to a single empire. They survived because countless communities cooperated. Caravan leaders understood mountain passes. Desert guides memorized hidden wells. Innkeepers provided shelter. Blacksmiths repaired broken wagon wheels. Stable owners cared for exhausted horses and camels. Every successful journey depended upon hundreds of ordinary people performing ordinary tasks remarkably well. To many medieval merchants, these roads seemed almost timeless. They had existed before their grandparents were born. Surely they would continue long after they themselves were gone. History, however, rarely guarantees permanence. One forgotten disaster began with with something travelers feared almost as much as starvation: the disappearance of water. Across large portions of Central Asia and the Middle East, entire trade routes depended upon scattered springs, rivers, and carefully maintained wells. Caravan journeys were planned with extraordinary precision. Experienced guides knew exactly how many days separated one reliable water source from the next. Mistakes could be fatal. A caravan carrying dozens of merchants, servants, guards, and pack animals consumed enormous quantities of water every single day. Camels endured harsh conditions better than horses. Even they possessed limits. One unusually dry season did not necessarily threaten the entire network. Several difficult years in succession told a different story. Small springs produced less water than expected. Seasonal streams dried earlier. Mountain snow melted differently from previous generations. Some wells that had served travelers for centuries began yielding only a fraction of their normal supply. At first, caravan leaders adjusted. Journeys began earlier in the morning to avoid the hottest hours. Additional water skins were loaded whenever possible. Routes were modified slightly to reach more dependable springs. These solutions worked for a while, then conditions worsened. The reliable became uncertain. Guides arriving at familiar watering places occasionally discovered nothing more than damp earth. Animals crowded around empty wells, sniffing desperately for moisture hidden below the surface. Men climbed into ancient stone shafts, hopping to collect even a few buckets from shrinking pools at the bottom. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they climbed back out, carrying only disappointment. Word spread quickly among experienced merchants. This route has become dangerous. That spring has nearly vanished. Avoid the southern crossing. Take the northern pass instead. Trade responded almost immediately. Caravans shifted toward safer routes whenever alternatives existed. Some oasis towns welcomed increased traffic. Others watched travelers disappear almost overnight. The consequences unfolded gradually, and in that once hosted 50 travelers each week now welcomed only 10. The local blacksmith repaired fewer wagons. Market stalls displayed fewer imported goods. Tax collectors noticed declining revenue. No walls had fallen. No army had attacked. Yet prosperity quietly slipped away. Entire communities had grown prosperous because of geography. A village located beside a dependable spring could flourish for generations. Remove the water. The reason for its existence slowly disappeared. Archaeologists have uncovered several medieval settlements that appear to have declined in precisely this way. Busy caravan stops gradually shrank. Workshops closed. Homes were abandoned. Eventually, drifting sand buried portions of streets that had once echoed with dozens of languages spoken by travelers from across the known world. Nature had silently rewritten the map. The travelers themselves faced increasing danger. Longer routes required more supplies. Additional supplies meant heavier loads. Heavier loads demanded stronger animals. Stronger animals consumed more food and water. Every practical solution introduced new complications. Experienced caravan leaders became masters of careful calculation. How much grain should each camel carry? Would that leave enough space for additional water? Could the caravan safely reach the next oasis before supplies ran low? Every decision balanced risk against necessity. One mistake could threaten everyone. The desert possessed remarkable patience. It did not rush. It simply waited. A broken wagon wheel, an injured camel, a delayed departure caused by illness. Any small problem could transform a carefully planned journey into a desperate race against thirst. Surviving travel accounts occasionally describe these experiences with understated honesty. Travelers wrote of dry wells, unexpected detours, animals collapsing from exhaustion, long stretches where no birds appeared overhead, because even wildlife had moved elsewhere in search of water. Such observations reveal environmental changes that official political histories rarely mention. Kings continued issuing decrees. Armies continued marching. Meanwhile, merchants quietly adjusted to a landscape becoming less predictable each year. Not every caravan failed. Many completed their journeys successfully despite increasing hardship. Their success reflected extraordinary preparation. Guides memorized alternative water sources. Merchants shared information gathered from previous expeditions. Communities along surviving routes cooperated to maintain wells and reservoirs whenever possible. Human ingenuity repeatedly delayed disaster. Sometimes it prevented it entirely. Still, some places could not be saved. One prosperous caravan town gradually emptied over several decades. Its market square became quieter. The voices of foreign merchants grew less frequent. Children who once watched endless lines of camels entering the gates now saw only occasional travelers passing through. The silence arrived slowly enough that few recognized it at first. An elderly shopkeeper might notice. There used to be more people. A stable owner remembered when every stall had been full. The local baker prepared fewer loaves because fewer customers appeared each morning. History often changes one ordinary day at a time. Religious communities adapted as well. Some monasteries and charitable foundations along important routes expanded their efforts to assist struggling travelers. Fresh water was offered freely whenever supplies allowed. Simple meals were shared. Shelter remained available regardless of wealth. Hospitality carried profound importance in regions where survival frequently depended upon the kindness of strangers. The decline of trade also influenced knowledge itself. Merchants transported more than merchandise. They carried books, mathematical ideas, medical observations, new agricultural techniques. Innovations traveled alongside commerce. When fewer journeys occurred, the exchange of ideas slowed as well. The effects proved subtle but meaningful. Civilizations often grow stronger through conversation. Silence limits opportunity. Looking back today, it is tempting to imagine the medieval world as isolated. The reality was far more connected than many people realize. A climate change affecting mountain snow could influence water supplies. Water shortages altered caravan routes. Changed routes weakened market towns. Declining trade affected local craftsmen. Reduced commerce slowed the movement of knowledge. One environmental shift echoed across thousands of miles. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within these forgotten disasters. Nothing existed entirely alone. The farmer depended upon the merchant. The merchant depended upon the road. The road depended upon the weather. The weather influenced everyone. By the time wetter seasons gradually returned to parts of the region, some caravan towns had already passed the point of recovery. Travelers simply preferred newer, more reliable routes. Abandoned buildings slowly surrendered to wind and sand. Wooden roofs collapsed. Stone walls crumbled. The desert reclaimed places that human determination had maintained for centuries. Modern archaeologists occasionally uncover fragments of these forgotten settlements. Pieces of pottery, rusted tools, coins dropped by hurried travelers, broken sections of irrigation channels, silent evidence that thriving communities once existed where today there is only empty landscape. To the people who lived there, these were not archaeological sites. They were home. Children had laughed in those streets. Merchants had argued over prices. Families had celebrated weddings. Neighbors had mourned together. Every abandoned settlement represented thousands of ordinary lives, slowly pushed elsewhere by circumstances beyond their control. As the old caravan roads continued their quiet transformation, medieval Europe prepared to face another challenge. This time, the disaster would not begin in distant deserts or beneath the sea. It would emerge from the forests themselves. Trees that had stood for centuries would fall in astonishing numbers, not because of axes or war, but because the weather would turn against them with a force few communities had ever witnessed, leaving entire landscapes transformed almost overnight. For generations, the forests had seemed almost eternal. Towering oaks stretched their branches across village roads. Beech trees formed cool green canopies above winding paths. Ancient pines stood watch over mountain slopes, surviving storms that had come and gone long before anyone living could remember. To medieval communities, forests represented far more than scenery. They supplied timber for homes and bridges, firewood for long winters, game for hunters, medicinal plants gathered by healers, pasture for pigs searching beneath fallen acorns. Countless villages depended upon nearby woodlands as completely as they depended upon their fields. Few imagined that entire forests themselves could become victims of disaster. Yet history records several forgotten years when violent storms swept across enormous regions with astonishing force. Unlike ordinary seasonal winds, these tempests arrived carrying enough power to reshape entire landscapes. The first signs appeared high above the treetops. Clouds gathered with unusual speed. Birds disappeared into dense cover. The air grew strangely still. Experienced woodsmen often noticed that unsettling silence before the wind finally arrived. Then, almost without warning, the forest began to move. Not gently, not gracefully. Entire crowns of ancient trees swayed together as powerful gusts roared through the canopy. Branches snapped like dry twigs. Leaves filled the air in swirling clouds. The sound became almost impossible to describe. It resembled distant thunder that never ended. Every tree amplified the noise. Millions of leaves, thousands of trunks, endless cracking timber. For anyone standing nearby, the forest itself seemed alive. Then the oldest trees began to fall. Massive oaks that had survived centuries of winters suddenly leaned beyond the point of recovery. Their roots tore free from waterlogged soil. Great circles of earth lifted into the air as trunks crashed downward, shaking the ground beneath them. One fallen tree struck another, then another. In some places, a chain reaction swept across entire hillsides. The destruction continued long after the first trees had fallen. Medieval villages, built beside forests, quickly realized the danger. Roofs disappeared beneath flying branches. Wooden barns collapsed. Livestock fled in panic. Travelers caught on forest roads desperately searched for clearings before falling trees blocked every direction. When dawn finally returned, familiar landscapes had vanished. Roads disappeared beneath tangled trunks. Bridges built from carefully selected timbers had been swept away by swollen rivers carrying broken trees downstream. Mills lost their water wheels after floating logs smashed into their foundations. Even communities, untouched by direct damage, faced months of difficult work, simply clearing transportation routes. The consequences stretched far beyond the storm itself. Timber had become abundant where forests had fallen, yet moving enormous trees required labor that many villages could scarcely spare. Some logs remained exactly where they had landed for years. Others were gradually cut into usable beams, helping rebuild damaged homes and churches. Nature had destroyed. Nature also provided the materials for recovery. The forests themselves healed slowly. Young saplings emerged wherever sunlight finally reached the woodland floor. Birds returned. Wildflowers spread through newly opened clearings. Within a generation, entirely new woodlands began replacing the fallen giants. The landscape changed. Life continued. Looking back across all of these forgotten medieval disasters, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. Floods drowned fertile valleys. Earthquakes shattered stone cities. Cold summers ruined harvests. Storm surges erased coastal villages. Hidden fungi poisoned bread. Trade routes declined as water disappeared. Violent winds transformed ancient forests. Most of these catastrophes never became as famous as the Black Death. Few are remembered in school classrooms. Many survive only because careful monks, travelers, merchants, and local officials quietly wrote down what they witnessed. Without their patient records, entire chapters of human experience might have disappeared forever. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson these forgotten disasters leave behind. History is not shaped only by emperors, famous battles, or celebrated victories. It is equally shaped by ordinary families rebuilding homes after floods, by farmers planting once again after failed harvests, by fishermen launching repaired boats after devastating storms, by craftsmen reopening workshops after earthquakes reduced their towns to rubble, by parents comforting frightened children through long winters, without knowing whether spring would bring relief. These people rarely appear in statues or paintings. Most left behind no portraits. Many names have been lost forever, yet they carried civilization forward through its most uncertain moments. Every bridge rebuilt, every field replanted, every loaf of bread baked after a season of hunger, every road reopened, every village restored. Those quiet acts of perseverance allowed future generations to inherit a world that still endured despite repeated hardship. The forgotten disasters of the Middle Ages remind us that history is not only a story of destruction, it is a story of recovery. Again and again, communities faced circumstances they could neither predict nor fully understand. Again and again, they adapted, sometimes slowly, sometimes imperfectly, but almost always with extraordinary determination. Centuries have passed since those storms, floods, famines, and earthquakes reshaped medieval lives. Castles have become ruins. Trade routes have shifted. Kingdoms have disappeared. Forests have grown where abandoned villages once stood. Rivers have carved new paths across ancient landscapes. Yet the resilience of those forgotten people continues to echo quietly through history, not because they escaped disaster, but because they refused to let disaster become the end of their story. And now, as our own journey through these forgotten medieval catastrophes comes to a gentle close, the night grows quiet once again. The villages sleep. The rivers continue their patient flow. The forests whisper in the wind. And somewhere beneath old fields, beneath forgotten streets, and beneath the foundations of long-vanished homes, the silent traces of those remarkable lives remain. waiting for anyone willing to remember them. Thank you for spending this peaceful journey through history with me. Sleep well, and remember, if you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.